Eeryk and Simon.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday night on the Eeryk and Simon show. Good evening, Eeryk. How you doing, young man?
Oh, I'm doing very well, Simon. I realized that it was Wednesday and they didn't have anything to do, so I thought I would join you again.
Good for you. Well, I'm very pleased that you could. And I'm also very pleased that everyone else could join us. And I don't know why my overlay hasn't come up in front of us. I've obviously done something wrong. Oh, I need to put it in front of there. Okay, there we go. All right. So what's been up for your week?
What's been up for my week? Well, I did spend all of what day was it now? Today is Wednesday. All of Monday morning watching the German elections, which I found quite fun. It was also my mother's birthday. I want to give her a shout out again. She was working on her birthday as a paramedic, hard working. They don't really get a choice in the matter, but good on her. But yeah, spend the morning watching that. That was thoroughly enjoyable. Outside of that, I've just been tinkering away, doing things, getting things prepared for the next few weeks. Yeah. How about yourself, Simon?
Oh, nice. Well, yeah, I've actually been mucking around with audio codecs and stuff like that. I've decided that I've finally decided to bite the bullet and to embrace digital music. I've been holding out for about 25 years playing vinyl, and so I've been mucking about, as you would have seen, with digital DJing software. I got to the point where it's like, yep, okay, maybe it is worthwhile buying a controller and doing this seriously. More seriously than I have been. So I'm looking forward to that arriving, and then I'll have the capability to mix both vinyl and digital music together. So I've been doing stuff like mucking about with audio codecs and bits and pieces like that. All right, I see that some of the locals, the regulars, are in the chat. Hello this evening to PLJ and Dirk Hop on my side. I did have to restart my stream on X, everyone. That was because I forgot to turn the chat on. So anyone who joined that version of the Eeryk and Simon show this evening, I hope that they eventually find that I've cancelled that stream and I've gone out for the second one. You guys can help us out by liking and sharing this broadcast, particularly if you're on X, so that people know that we are here doing this. All right, now I see you sent me through a bunch of interesting topics that you want to talk about this week, and the first one coming to us was about this about some changes amongst the civil servants conducting the second Royal Commission of Inquiry into the COVID response under the Ardern regime. Let me bring that up, and maybe you can walk us through it.
Yeah. So yeah, in the last couple of days, there was the breaking story, I think, yesterday from Paula Penfold of stuff about the COVID inquiry, the second phase that was proposed and got over the line by New Zealand First. That, there's been some high-profile people within that who have resigned, and it's kind of calling into question, what's going on, whether or not it's going to be completed, whether it undermines what they've done to date and so far and so forth. So quickly start at the top, just get a bit of an introduction, then we'll go down a bit. The executive director and 2 legal counsel at the COVID Royal Commission of Inquiry have quit, raising serious questions of the status of the inquiry and the way it has been run. Executive Director Helen Porticky and legal counsel Christy McDonald KC and Nick Whittington have yet to publicly announce their resignations or the reasons they are leaving, but Stuff understands that the trio have quit due to concerns about processes at the inquiry. Porticky had only been in the role since October 2024. It does seem they didn't have anything anything more of value to contribute to why they've resigned. It's all kind of a bit weird, in my opinion. Like when I was unfortunately watching the news last night as I was cooking dinner, I was there with a bit of this look on my face. That's what I had. I was like, what on earth is this? I mean, you wouldn't run away from this paycheck unless, you either needed to hide something and you didn't want to hide it, or you didn't want to be responsible for exposing something. I can't see.
Well,
yeah.
I have a view on that, and I'm really conscious that we saw some commentary 6 months ago from the New Zealand First Ministers, who are members of the cabinet of the current government, talking about how they were fighting, and I'm quoting here, tooth and nail to get the terms of reference for the second COVID inquiry expanded. Okay, and they were facing massive resistance from that. And when they didn't actually say that, but the only resistance it would have come from is their National Party colleagues around that cabinet table. The National Party is doing everything it possibly can to insulate Ardern and her co-conspirators in the Ardern regime, because they probably as well might be implicated for some of the things that the National Party did. Again, this is supposition and it's just my opinion, but it seems to me the National Party is utterly committed to ensuring that justice is not achieved for the New Zealand people in that regard. Now, given that background, one of the questions that I would have is whether or not these three individuals have chosen to resign from their positions simply because they are facing resistance. And I say that because I have heard secondhand that the COVID inquiry is facing massive stonewalling, massive resistance from on high for everything. All right, that everything that this Royal Commission of Inquiry has tried to get, even as little inconsequential things like office supplies or people returning their phone calls or providing information, has proved inordinately difficult. And I wonder if they are being deliberately sabotaged. This is another possibility. They're being deliberately sabotaged, and they're quitting because they simply can't do their jobs. The second option is, as you say, that they feel that they're that they don't want to be associated with whatever its conclusions are going to be.
Yep, I mean, yeah, that was useful insight, I feel, even if it is secondhand information. I mean, to think that there isn't anything behind the scenes that's deliberately trying to derail the inquiry would be naive. It's quite clear that it's been coming up against resistance because these terms of reference weren't included in the original inquiry for the very reason they didn't want them looked into. And that's why New Zealand First managed to get so much support on this one issue. It could have been the difference of 1% in this case, and they only made it by just over 1%. So the fact that they had to work hard to get it through, and to get it over the line, to get these terms of reference added, and furthermore, the stuff right here, this article is designed to sway people, in my opinion, to not believe that this second phase is necessary. And that's why right at the bottom there is a poll, which as of right now isn't exactly going in Stuff's favour. Currently 67% of people think that we do indeed need this second phase of the inquiry. But if we come down to history of the inquiry very quickly, just so we can establish a little bit more insight into what's happened to date. The then Labour government announced a Royal Commission of Inquiry in December 2022 with a mandate to look at the lessons learned from New Zealand's response to COVID-19 that should be applied in preparation for a future pandemic. But all of the main opposition parties objected to the terms of reference by being too narrow, and after the 2023 election, the coalition government said it intended to expand the terms to ensure, as a matter of urgency, that a full-scale and wide-ranging inquiry was conducted. Well, for starters, I feel like there wasn't really opposition from the opposition of the time, in the way that it's being made out here. They're trying to suggest that the entire coalition government, as it stands, was always on the same page about this issue, that these terms of reference needed to be expanded, and that this second phase of the inquiry needed to take place. If that was the case, National would have adopted that as their policy at the election, and you wouldn't have needed New Zealand First to propose it in the first place. Add to that the fact that, as you've said, there was always pushback on it, and they had to fight to get the terms of reference as they are. I think that speaks volumes. But additionally, it's just gaslighting from the Labour government to suggest that they actually ever wanted to learn lessons about the response from COVID-19. They're sitting here and saying, oh yeah, we did absolutely everything that we possibly could. We didn't put a foot wrong, but where we did do wrong, oh yeah, we'll make sure we do it better next time. But the reality is, all of the areas where they failed the most egregiously are all of the areas that they deliberately didn't include in their initial inquiry.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing that is worth keeping in mind is that New Zealand did actually have a pandemic preparation plan, which the Labour regime of Jacinda Ardern just threw straight out the window. They didn't use it at all. They didn't reference it. They didn't apply any of that pre-planning to the COVID response. They just made it up as they went along. And you're right, the narrative is, okay, maybe there were some potential mistakes that were made. Let's learn some lessons from it and no one is responsible. And that is just complete nonsense. The whole, people died. This is the thing. People died. Civil rights were infringed. People have lifelong injuries. This requires, our democracy requires there to be a full accounting for the culpable, to be held to account for what happened during that period. We need that just for justice to be done, but also as an object lesson to the next tyrant, if you ask me, who comes along and decides, you know what, I am going to use this opportunity of a calamity to restructure our society along my ideological lines. Let's not forget that in the middle of doing all of this, in the middle of a pandemic response, the Stalinists in the Ardern regime, Jacinda Ardern, Chris Hipkins, all of those people decided it was the right time to completely restructure New Zealand's health system. Completely centralize it and Stalinize it in Wokington by disestablishing all of the DHBs and flushing tens of billions of dollars right at the same time that our hospital system was completely overloaded. It was absolutely disastrous. Then they tried to introduce apartheid on top of it with a separate health organization rather for Maori. What it was all about was ideological. It was all about utilizing the calamity to achieve their ideological objectives, and none of those people cared about the damage to people's lives, to people's businesses, and to the fundamental principles of our democracy that entailed, as long as they could achieve their end objectives, if you ask me. So I think it is absolutely crucial. What have you heard about replacements for these three individuals?
I can't say I've heard anything about it, to be completely honest. But I suppose at least one of them's crucial. You'd think they'd have to replace them with someone, wouldn't you? But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how these things work, if I'm completely honest.
Yeah, well, I'd be like, normally what would happen for the commissioner or the lead on something like this, they would be going to the responsible minister, or at least a friendly minister if that wasn't a possibility, and saying, look, we've got a problem here. There are issues with this inquiry that need to be resolved. We can't do our jobs. Right now, it would be really interesting to know what the scope of those discussions is, because I haven't heard anything about that. I haven't heard anything from any government minister, and I'm very much including in that New Zealand First Ministers about why this has happened. And it's almost like they're saying, well, okay, Cindy and her little friends did some bad stuff. Why don't we all just forget about it and move on? And I don't know about you, but I don't think New Zealanders are ready to move on. I think the majority of people in this country want to see an accounting of what happened during the COVID response.
Yeah, and looking at this, I do believe the minister in charge is Brooke Van Velden. At least with respect to the internal affairs. Obviously, this is a matter of internal affairs with the resignations, I suppose, and all of that. But I haven't really heard anything from New Zealand First or, ACT or National on the matter, with the exception of Van Velden saying she does not wish to speculate on why the Consul, Assist, and Executive Director have chosen to resign. I mean, that's not exactly useful information. We could have all figured that out or reached the same conclusion there. Though, what I do want to mention is that I think the inquiry, just personally, or the second phase is important, because unlike the first round, I've actually submitted on this round of the inquiry. And I decided to do something a little bit more out of the box because not a lot of people would have had this experience or this insight to things. And this is, people in our prisons, in our prison systems, who simply lack any ability to research for themselves as to, what the government is telling them or suggesting they do. And so this is not just an issue of vaccination and dealing with pandemics, but in kind of all areas of life. If something new comes about, at the end of the day, say what you want about people in prisons, but the last thing you want is for them to become guinea pigs, or to be subjected to treatments or trials of things based purely out of ignorance because they're not provided more information. And so the basis of what my submission was is I wanted to outline that, hey, look, when prisoners began getting vaccinated in 2021, and this was a lot earlier than the general public. It was around the same time as the essential workers and health professionals, so like kind of May, June. They weren't given adequate information about these things. We had the only real insight into these jabs was what the news told us at 6 p.m, and that was it. The news, the radio, nothing else. Even the staff members there could only tell you so much because, for the most part, they only knew what the news and radio told them as well. But what I soon learned once I did have access to the internet again was just how little information I was actually provided at the time that I was offered and subsequently injected, with the vaccinations. And so, given the fundamental lack of information about the efficacy and also the risks, the fact that there was no reference to risks of potential heart problems, among other things, at the time that we were offered these things, it's basically using them like guinea pigs and saying, hey, look, we're just going to put them in you before we roll it out to the majority of the general public.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's like, that is not informed consent, right? Like, if you've got a whole bunch of people in prison who are disenfranchised by law and saying, look, you're going to have this, and not providing them with information and not giving them anything like a choice, that is serious medical misadventure. That's really criminal to do that to people.
And to clarify, whilst they didn't force you to take it, I mean, let's think about it from someone who is hoping to be released and go back into the society. If you are told every single day that you can't leave this place until you abide by the rules and expectations of society, and then a vaccination comes up and it's expected that you take it because that's what society would like, you're going to take it. Otherwise, you think that's going to be held against you in any court appearance, any parole hearing. And so that's going to be a form
it's
of
a coercion
on its own.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, you make a really good point. And I think that that's one that is worth, I'm very glad that you made a submission that encapsulated that, because it's representing a disenfranchised segment of society, which is often overlooked in these matters. All right, quickly turning to the chat, because I've got some people I want to say hello to. Dirk Hopp says, good supposition, Nat Labour collusion, same on Pike River, same on child abuse, and same on CCC false flag. I don't know if that CCC was false flag, but I do take your point. PLJ says, behind the scenes affairs would likely be driven by paranoia, reliability from US, Doge, and previous executive orders are rights violators. That is true, and I agree with it. Dr. Phil is here. Good evening. Don't forget messing with all those people's operation schedules. You're exactly right. There were people who lost their lives because they couldn't get operations that they needed. There were people who had pain relief that, medical issues that should have been resolved who couldn't. I saw it from within the ambulance service. There was a thing called ramping, right? Like, what you get with an ambulance crew is how effective they are, okay? And they might do like about 15 on average jobs in a 10-hour shift. During COVID, it was down to 2, and one of the reasons was they used ambulances as overflow. So rather than being out on the road, the ambulances were stacked outside the hospitals, being used effectively as mobile beds. And what it meant was there were huge numbers of people requiring emergency services who simply could not get it, and that went on for 2 years. While that was happening, the Labour government of Jacinda Ardern and Chris Hipkins specifically denied that it was. They denied it. They lied about it. When Shane Retty was talking about it, they pilloried him. Their friends in the media pilloried him for that. Meanwhile, anyone who was working in the health sector, particularly anything to do with ambulances, knew it was absolutely 100% true. So you make a very good point there, Phil. There are a huge number of people whose health was negatively impacted because of what Labour did to the health system as well as what they did during the pandemic. Shelley is here. Good evening. And PLJ says a grand jury of citizens would suffice. I don't know. It sounds a little bit too much like vigilantism to me, PLJ. Shortland Chambers is here. Good evening. I admit it was a tough time for everyone, but ultimately people made their choices. Chris Hipkins, yeah, exactly right. I'm never going to let that man live it down. I'm not really a man, he's a ginger kind. But yeah, saying that is just astonishing. That it is a damning indictment of New Zealand's politics that Chris Hipkins could say something like that and not instantly lose his political career, yet he gets away with it. In another Western democracy, he would have lost his job straight away. He'd have been chased out of politics for lying like that. Joel says, good evening. Contrarian bad actors are all over getting in the way of COVID lockdown overreach and accountability. I think that is right. Sue is here. Collective amnesia. A lot of people don't want to be reminded of their role in denouncing their neighbours, family, friends, or how easily they acquiesced. That is a very, very good point, Sue, and it is a really, really disconcerting, the number of people who just went along with this authoritarian, anti-democratic bullshit and dobbed in Stasi like their neighbours for breaching Ardern's rules. That is a damning indictment of the New Zealand psyche. Kid, you got any comments you wanted to reply to?
Yes, I do. So, quick hello to Phil. Hopefully you are doing well this evening. Harold says, asks if we can raise a couple of topics himself for us to discuss. There is at least one that I can dabble on when I go into my next topic later. But he does quickly ask, is Eeryk dangerous or just a distraction? Very quickly to that, I would say both. And then the latter is the growth of communism amongst the younger demographic driven by education? That is something I can very much touch on in my next article. Harold also asks, says, no surprises the inquiry is stonewalled. Too many people made money. I mean, yeah, money does make the world go round. Hugh Stafford, hello. He says, is there any word of US aid contributing to Jacinda's grift? I mean, I think we can make a pretty educated guess and suggest it probably did. But I can neither confirm nor deny that. Harold once again says, justice will not happen. Too many birds of a feather flocking in the current government. And I was saying this about New Zealand first yesterday, especially when it comes to things like our foreign affairs policy. And I mean, I know Winston Peters is the foreign minister, but he's not the foreign dictator. He doesn't dictate foreign policy. He simply implements it and is the person who deals with other foreign representatives across the world on the government's behalf. Sure, he has influence, but he doesn't dictate policy. So I was like, the problem with New Zealand First is they are a nationalist party of 8 people in a government in a coalition of 59 globalists. What do you want them to do? There is only so much. And I think the fact that they got the likes of this phase 2 of the inquiry over the line is showing that they can do something. The fact that they are kind of pushing back a little bit on things like the World Economic Forum and the United Nations here and there, silly little things like the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, stuff like that. They are kind of having the narrative, having the conversation, but there's only so much they can do. Very quickly, I do want to, you had a comment, Simon, about the ramping with, ambulances being used as mobile beds effectively. And I was directly impacted by that. I was collapsed on the side of the road, not able to breathe properly with crazy chest pain and all of this stuff. And I had to drag myself back to my house, and I was told by the ambulance, we can't send you an ambulance. I'm like, okay, I'm a 22-year-old guy at the time, and I can barely stand. I've got all the signs of someone who's got a serious issue with his heart right now, and you can't send me an ambulance? 2 hours later, they say, well, we can get you a taxi to your nearest medical clinic.
Yep.
I'm like,
yep. And that
wow.
was all Ardern and Hipkins. That was entirely their ideology impacting people's health directly. All right. Simon Futter is here on YouTube. Good evening, young man, who says hello to Eeryk as well. Shelley says, I do have to say I did get a little satisfaction when I kicked that car door with a dent behind it during the lockdown. Yeah, that's pretty funny. And Phil says, I believe USA did put money towards the Christchurch call. I wouldn't be at all surprised, Phil, and I would also believe that George Soros's Open Foundation, rather Open Society, they're really big on supporting left-wing causes around the world. So things like USA, things like the Open Society and all that sort of stuff, there needs to be some attention paid to how much money has gone and where it has gone. You can be absolutely certain that Ardern was the recipient of some of that money. Okay, kid, are we ready to move on to the next one? You got some people you need to shout out to.
No, we're good. Just Joel being Joel. We're right.
Joel being Joel. All right. Okay. Well, it's probably my turn for an article, everyone. And I read this fantastic article. It's really, really long, though. Where am I supposed to go? I'm supposed to go here. This is an article that came to us from Matt Goodwin, and I posted it on social media this afternoon because it was just so good. And it's about how the woke left has lost. And I agree with him. The woke left is in full retreat because normal people have said enough of this bullshit. Everywhere around the West, of course, except New Zealand. New Zealand is dragging the chain. We still have massive wokery in every sector of society. And a large part of the reason for that is while it's being rejected by New Zealanders as much as it is by people in other countries, unlike those people in those lucky countries, we don't have a government that is prepared to be anti-woke. Quite the reverse. We've got a very woke government. We have in Christopher Luxon, a party which is utterly committed to wokery. He has senior cabinet ministers who are fans of drag queen grooming time. He himself is all in on the World Economic Forum, on climate nonsense, while the rest of the world is moving on and the pendulum is swinging back against wokery, as Mr. Goodwin is about to describe for us. Here in New Zealand, it is yet to occur. In my opinion, we are not going to see a change until at least Chris Luxon is gone, and preferably the National Party is a minor party in a nominally right coalition. Let me read you just a little bit of it. The problem with this article is it's absolutely massive, so I'm going to struggle to pull out the interesting bits that I wanted to talk to you about, but I'm going to give it a go. Matt Goodwin, wrong bit. The woke left, he writes, which I define as a social movement that views minorities as sacred but majorities as suspicious, if not evil, is now firmly in retreat. It has lost. In America, Donald Trump is busily rooting out the woke left's beliefs from universities, federal government, and other public sector institutions, while reasserting the primacy of biological sex over gender gobbledygook. New Zealanders could be so lucky. In Europe, he writes, from Germany to the Netherlands, rising numbers of voters are flocking to anti-woke nationalist populist parties, at least partly to express their opposition to the woke left's fanatical commitments to mass uncontrolled immigration, open borders, identity politics, and hostility towards Western civilization. What do you think of that for an intro, kid?
I mean, it's pretty clear for all to see how many people, especially young people, young men, notably, are deciding, you know what, I quite like that populist party over there. I quite like Reform. I quite like AFD. I quite like NZ First. Even NZ First is kind of getting a few younger people interested in it. Not speaking for myself, of course, but yeah, I mean, even MAGA, you could argue, is very much in the same camp. We like to separate MAGA from the Republicans, as they insist. The Donald Trump succeeded massively off the back of young people and a response against just wokeism everywhere, just stupid ideas in every element of life. And people are like, I'm a bit fed up with this. I don't want it in my university. I don't want it in my child's school. I don't want it in my workplace. I'm just over it. And so people are naturally looking at the alternative. I notice the belief is that fascism in the 20th century was a response to communism or Marxism. And whilst I'm sure that's true to a degree, it's like, well, whilst these leftists cry, oh my goodness, the fascists are making a resurgence, well, maybe you should look at history and figure out, okay, why did fascism come to be in the first place and think maybe we're a little bit too radically left, and that's why these people are turning towards these nationalist, even ultra nationalist parties who are willing to implement some degree of authoritarian policy to clamp down on your lunacy.
I think you're right, but one could also argue that the rise of fascism was, excuse me, at least in Germany's case, uh, uh, um, a reaction to the social excesses of the Weimar Republic. But I take your point, and I think that, it seems to me really naive of the National Party to just not be aware that they are hemorrhaging votes like every other beige, centrist, woke, nominally centre-right party in the world has before them, to parties that are saying, no, we don't want this anymore. National refuses to change. They are just being ever more centrist, always chasing that soft Labour voter, hoping they can be woke enough to convince people in Grey Lynn to vote for Christopher Luxon instead of Jacinda Ardern. Coming back to the article, Mr. Goodwin writes, the woke left are anti-democratic and illiberal because they will always sacrifice free speech, free expression, and good faith debate on the altar of what they think is protecting minorities from emotional harm. But what the woke left perceive to be emotional harm is, say, having an entirely legitimate debate about lowering immigration or demanding a national inquiry into rape gangs. And so, in turn, the woke left demand that entirely acceptable and legitimate debates are shut down to protect what they see as the emotional safety of immigrants. This is why the woke left is illiberal and anti-democratic. And I think this is exactly right. We see that here in New Zealand, where we actually have people in Parliament talking about how, submissions on Treaty Principles Bill, and we saw this from Tory the Hut, Tory Whanau, who's the mayor of Wokington, talking about how democracy was getting in the way of achieving their societal objectives. These people are inherently anti-democratic, don't you reckon, Kid?
Oh, absolutely. They believe that putting virtue, or what they believe virtue is ahead of everything else, is the only way to have a flourishing society, or a society that represents their values. You see, values, as far as they're concerned, is more important than actually having a functioning society that has a set of rules that people follow. And you can see how they do this, and the way that they view illegal immigrants, for example, the likes of Ricardo Menendez March. He won't call them illegal immigrants. He will call them something along a variation of they have a issue with their immigration status that can and will be resolved by us if given the opportunity. It's like, they refuse to say it what it is. They beat around the bush and try and make it out like they are the victims in the situation. Not that they're overstayers, not that they're this. It was a bit of a weird way that he described the immigration case last week, so I can't recall what it was off the top of my head. But yeah, that's how they go about it. Virtue is paramount. Everything else is secondary.
Yeah, that's it. And the last bit I wanted to read to you is this: the woke left only have themselves to blame, because this is what happens when you spend years trying to force extreme, divisive, and unscientific views and beliefs down people's throats while simultaneously telling them they cannot express their opinion. They cannot have free speech, and then deriding them as misinformed fascists or bigots when they do challenge the orthodoxy. The woke left have lost. Their movement is over. Their ridiculous ideology is being called out for what it is, and their deeply fanatical activists are now being exposed for what they are: dogmatic extremists who have completely lost touch with reality. Don't you think that pretty much describes everyone in the Green Party?
Oh, well, yes, that's a prerequisite for being in the Green Party, of course. My problem is the left has got a stranglehold on the intellectual class. And the problem with that is too many people who aren't, I don't know, political tragics accept what the intellectual class says far too easily. It's like, okay, so that academic over there has this belief, So it must be true. I'm not going to look into that myself. So let's just go along with this climate change hoax bullshit and vote Labour because, oh, National's a little bit too soft on that issue for me, despite the fact it's just some made up nonsense by an academic whose ideology dictates everything that he writes. So that's the biggest issue I find is that it's not necessarily that that we can see how ludicrous their ideas are, but it's that many ordinary people don't quite realize how far the rot goes. It's one thing to look at a far left politician and be like, okay, you're a nutter, but it's another to acknowledge that that far left politician is supported by the person that is held up as the number one expert on this issue by every single mainstream media source in the country.
You're very right, and actually, Mr. Goodwin went into his article about how there is that capture of extreme left wing views within society's institutions, and he talked about it specifically in academic institutions, in the media, and in his case, he was talking about the BBC. By the way, there were riots, or rather, a demonstration outside of the BBC overnight because of the bias of some of their coverage about the war in the Holy Land and £400,000 promoting a very, very one-sided narrative. And I think that that's the other aspect of it. While it is true that we have this issue where, to me, I believe wokery, we should be just rooting it out, right? Like any civil servant, any academic, blue hair, ring in the nose, gone, right? You're talking about critical race theory in a sociology department, gone, no longer on the taxpayer fund for any of that shit. I think that we need to be going through getting rid of any of these people that are taxpayer funded, but it is right, they are captured throughout the institutions, media, academia, the civil service, politics, the judiciary, you name it, the police, they are all there wokering all of the time, right? And there is a reaction to it. We're seeing it in people's voting preferences, and I'm sure you're going to talk about the polarization amongst young people in Germany during your segment coming up. And this needs to be addressed, and other countries are doing it, because the pendulum has swung, and not every country is as far advanced as the Americans are in rooting out all of this nonsense, but they're going to get there in the end. And unfortunately for us, New Zealand is going to be last. All right, we should probably move on because that does bring us on to your next bit. Do you have any comments in the chat you want to address?
Yes, very quickly. Welcome Overachiever says woke Marxist ideology is deeply infested in our government departments. It's grassroots up. Unelected bureaucrats instruct their respected ministers who can't, won't bite back. I feel like there is a bit of that, where the bureaucrats think that they can tell the ministers what to say, do, and think. Harold says, so how do individuals become educated in those ideas? Well, think for yourself. I think autodidacts probably are much needed. Hugh Stafford says, but they do what it takes to get votes rather than have principles. We need an AFD type here. Well, given the next article is about AFD, I think that's a very good place to leave it and move on.
All right. Okay. Well, I'll say. PLJ says Groomiversity is drowning in woke. You're so true, man. If I had my way, PLJ, and I discussed this for Polity World with Dr. James, I would get rid of the entire humanities faculty, with the sole exception of the philosophy department and maybe the psychology department. Though he made a reasonable argument, and also keeping the classics and convinced me. Shelley says, here was I thinking Simon doesn't swear and polite, and he said BBC more than once. Yes, I'm sorry about that. I think I should probably wash my mouth out with soap. All right. The German elections. I don't know if anyone tuned into the kids' coverage on Monday morning, but he got right into it. It was awesome. Stood up a live episode and he ran it all by himself and gave really great coverage for people in this part of the world about what was happening blow by blow in the German elections. And I didn't catch it live, but I caught up with him afterwards and I thought his coverage was really good. So he's really across this issue. So I'll bring up his next article. Here we go. There it is.
So this comes from ADL, Alternative for Germany, AFD party. what you need to know. Now, I found this rather interesting. The reason why I actually decided to cover the German election in the first place was in large part because Elon Musk had been so vocal in his support for them. And I was thinking, okay, let's see if Elon's onto something here or if he's just being a bit silly. Anyways, I had a look and I was like, okay, I'm interested. I'm interested by the whole idea that the normal German parties, the mainstream German parties, which they have the CDU, CSU, who just won the election, and then the SPD, who are the outgoing government. Um, you know, they have this process of they keep the far right out at all costs. So conveniently for them, they can label the AfD party far right for a range of reasons, the validity of which are, I suppose, up for debate. But what I found interesting is that they hold the far right to the standard where we will refuse to go into coalition with them, a bit like how France kept Rassemblement National out. But they don't really have the same issue with far left parties. But, I personally find far left parties far more dangerous at present. But
You're
whatever.
right. It's a double standard.
Yeah, it is a double standard. But yeah, moving on to the article specifically, what is AfD? AfD was founded in 2013 as an anti-European Union party. AfD has since radicalized and become an extremist anti-immigrant party whose aim is to eliminate the free democratic basic order, according to a 2023 report by the German Institute for Human Rights. If I hear anything called National Institute of Human Rights, I immediately think you are ideologically captured and you are a leftist. AfD leaders have made anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and anti-democratic statements detailed below, such as the German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, BFE, its Domestic Intelligence Agency. Again, Domestic Intelligence Agency, I immediately think Deep State, can I trust you? Which monitors extremist threats to Germany's democracy, has listed AfD as an officially suspected extremist organization and classified its youth wing Young Alternative as extremist in April 2023. The state-level BFE offices in Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia have gone a step further and classified the AfD party as a whole as extremist. As a suspected extremist organization, AfD is subject to BFE intelligence collection, including the use of informants and surveillance of individuals and their communications. So, reading that, you can clearly see that the entire German system is working against the AfD. They view them as an extremist far-right party who is, the second coming of Nazi Germany, and they must be prevented from obtaining any power at all costs.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about that is that they've just come second in the German federal elections, and I'm really conscious of the source here. This is the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, who are an extremist group. They're extremely Zionist. They're extremely pro-Jewish and very, 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 very ideological in their descriptions of things. In my experience, so this kind of fits, I think, very much in their narrative, but by extension, it's also the narrative of the mainstream German media coverage, from what I see.
Yes, and very much so. When I was watching the coverage, which got so badly copyright striked, the entire video was taken down in terms of couldn't be viewed by anyone, which was interesting. I don't care. It's whatever it is. I did my best to resolve that and have as much of it available as possible. But the reason I picked this source is because, as you say, they are basically the flip of the coin, or the other side of the coin on this matter, as in being pretty extremist and ideological in their description of things. But I feel like this does represent the general narrative shared by at least mainstream media, not only in Germany, but in other parts of the world. And so by using this particular article, I can then highlight what their actual policy says. Because I went ahead and I decided, you know what? I'm going to download their policy manifesto and have a read. Specifically, the parts related to democracy. Because if we recall in this small section at the start of the article, it says to eliminate the free democratic basic order and that they have anti-democratic statements, etc. anti-democratic statements, I'm sure you could argue, oh yeah, that's horrible. But how about we have a look at the actual policy agenda on the matter of democracy? In this case, democracy and core values, as proposed by AFD for the election they've just had. A referendum based on the Swiss model, which is to give the people far more say on what actually happens, what laws are actually passed. Lean government for free citizens, so basically deregulation and reducing the amount of things that government is actually responsible for. Guarantee the separation of powers. You couldn't really have a more pro-democracy policy if you tried. Separate political office and membership of parliament. So that is to ensure that the executive branch doesn't have overreach into the legislative branch. So that is, once again, upholding the separation of powers. That's an extremely democratic policy to have. Limit influence and power of political parties. This is to reduce the amount of influence political parties, their donors and so forth have over the legislature and the executive branches of government. Realign party funding in constitutional law. I believe this is so, can't quite remember, but it was about holding the parties more accountable for their funding, how those worked in relation to constitutional law. Free election of candidates. This one is, oh yes, it was a matter of every single person on the, so how an MMP in New Zealand, for example, we have lists, right? And people that are on the list just get put in to Parliament based on wherever their party ranks them. This gives the people in society more power over what those lists actually look like. So they can propose people on those lists, and the people actually rank their preferences of those proposals of who actually fills those seats. It's a little bit messy, to be fair, but it's a policy all the same to give more power to the people to determine who is in charge of them. There was reduced size of German parliaments, I suppose. The number of people in parliaments, generally speaking, are somewhat inconsequential. I suppose by reducing the number of people in there, you have less money to spend on, wages and so forth. Term limits. Okay, yeah, fascists are huge fans of term limits. Direct election of federal president by the people, a bit like the US in that respect. Curtail lobbyism. I suppose we have quite a bit of that issue here. I suppose a lot of criticism of this current government at the early days was that their policies around smoking and smoke-free laws and all of that were the result of tobacco industry lobbying them to make these changes. There are a couple more. Reform parliamentary pension scheme to reduce burden on taxpayers. Pretty self-explanatory. They want to ensure that people who have been in Parliament aren't just
all right. So what you're saying is that in general, the policies of the AFD are pretty democratic. There's nothing really out there. Would that be a fair synopsis?
Yeah, you get the point. That's what it is. But I tend to ramble. But yeah, that's a fair synopsis. Fundamentally, they can sit here and they can spill whatever narrative they want. But if you go read the policy, it's a little bit difficult to uphold that position.
What occurs to me, it was really fascinating to see, is it Merz, the new chancellor for Germany from the CDU? Like sorry, what's his name?
Yes.
Merz. Yeah. So within 24 hours, he repudiated what he said about closing Germany's borders. He went into that election talking about how they were going to start looking at controls on illegal immigration, but he walked that back within 24 hours, and it was just astonishing. It just seems to be that it is a centre-right, centre-left government once again in Germany, and just business as usual. Since the end of World War II, those two parties have formed grand coalition governments on 4 or 5 separate occasions, and they're just doing it again. While they're in the driver's seat now, it was the centre-left that was in the driver's seat before, and it just continues. I think the really big difference this time is that we have the AFD as the number one opposition party to this coalition. What do you think about the impact of that?
Yeah, well, I think what's important here and what AFD will be happy about is the fact that they ask that the CDU is somewhat backtracking on their immigration stance, because I think one of the reasons CDU would have been hardline or saying, yeah, we're going to actually do something about this immigration issue, is to try and take votes away from AFD. Now that the voters can see, or hopefully remember in a few years from now, that the CDU were full of shit, they'll be like, okay, AFD maybe does need our vote. Not to mention the fact that they will just be going into coalition with the party they just voted out as being in charge.
Exactly.
And they will see
It's
that
no
nothing
change.
is changing.
Yes,
and so
that's right. That's
both
right. And I
sides.
see. I think you're exactly right. I think the AFD will capitalise on that. But I also wanted to get your thoughts, because just before we came on air, you were talking about the polarisation in young people, how the number one and number two parties that people under the age of 25, so 18 to 25-year-olds, voted for was either the AFD or the far left. Now, the far left in Germany are full-on far left. Like, they are proper, put people in death camps, gulags, just full-on communists, and they were massively supported, I think even more so than the nominally threat to democracy that everyone goes on about, AFD. I'd get your thoughts on that, but I'm also, I should have brought it up and I didn't think to, but I saw a really worrying statistic in Germany, and that was that a massive proportion of German women under the age of 25, it was something like 80+% of German women between the age of 18 and 55 voted for either those extreme left-wing communists or the extreme left-wing Greens. So what are your thoughts, being as that's your demographic, of what's going on there?
Well, I think for the men's side of things, I mean, it was clear that the majority of men between 18 and 24, 18, 25 voted AFD across all of Germany. And then I think
but it wasn't massive, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
but
it was just,
massive.
it was a tendency.
Yeah, it was a tendency. But, I mean, it wasn't massive, but it was still a clear advantage on the other parties. But then if you go across and you see the 18 to 24, 25-year-old women, it's pretty much just all that far left extremist Die Linke, and then either Greens or SPD. It's really bizarre and concerning, especially when you consider that these people are all they're growing up in the same areas, but they're reaching very different conclusions. And for me,
a concern.
This shows the difference between how the male brain and the female brain works. Whereas the men are going towards common sense, sorry, women, the women are going towards virtue.
That's very true. And Lord Toby Young, he's a lord now, but he wasn't when I spoke to him. He came out and on a speaking tour that was arranged by the Free Speech Union, and I spoke to him about this because it's a tendency we see around the world of women under the age of 50 predominantly vote against their own interests for left-wing parties. And I asked him, it's like, okay, what are you doing about it in Britain? What strategies have you come up with? And he was as stumped as I was about how it is that we can get through to women that, because you get some women under the age of 50 who realize, no, they don't want men in their sports. They don't want them grooming children in libraries dressed in frocks. They don't want them in their changing rooms and in their bathrooms, but then they turn around and vote for Jacinda Ardern and Chloe Swarbrick. And this is a real problem with young women who just have this attitude that, oh no, despite the fact that our country is now buggered by Ardern, she was on the cover of a woman's magazine, so because of that, I voted for her. And the woman's magazine just before the election will have a really nice photograph of Chloe Swarbrick standing in a field wearing a white dress, so I'll vote for her as well. And that's kind of the be all and end all of it. And so, I really do. I'm at a loss as well about what we do to actually educate young women about what is in their interest and what isn't.
Yeah. But I was thinking, considering the demographic, and this goes back to the comment that I had received right at the top of the broadcast, considering the fact that, both men and women of this, demographic are going to university, that disparity between far left and the apparent far right, just based on gender, is quite stark and rather confusing. I would say that you're not going to see that same sort of disparity in New Zealand, and maybe that's in some part because of the way Germany is divided down ideological lines in some degree. I mean, as we see right now, AfD and CDU, the actual states that they won, pretty much a pound for pound, exactly how East and West Germany looked.
PLJ made that point a few minutes ago in my chat about that's right. Like if you actually look at it, the regional map, those who supported the AfD are those pretty much exactly who lived under communism until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. These people know what it is like to live in a totalitarian police state and voted against it, and lots of other except with the exception of Berlin, and it is a real tendency in that regard, right? Like people who've experienced it don't like it.
Exactly. And that's why I find out there's a lot of like Cuban Americans who are like, no, not much fan of them Democrats.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Marie Buskers are here in the chat. It's weaponized kindness. These girls strive to be good. They're groomed by school peers, social media. Okay, Marie, I take that on board, and I think that might be a discussion that you and I might be having with our mutual friend in a week or two. Dirk Hop says Frankfurt is half white, so like USA, they're being flooded into key electorates. There's your Marxist vote. Yeah, that might be true. All right. Before we move on, have you got any comments from your chat you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, very quickly. John Kid Muldoon Eaton says, of course it was the ADL. Yep, it clearly was. Overachiever says, small government is good government. AfD represents a shift of the Overton window. Germany will truly be in trouble considering J.D. Vance warned them to drop the firewall and embrace democracy. Yeah, enjoy those tariffs, Germany.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it's quite an Americanization, right? Because the term for that in Europe wide has been for 20 years cordon sanitaire. All right.
Yeah.
But that's probably too difficult for ignorant Americans to pronounce. So it's being rewritten into public discourse by the media as a firewall. It sounds fucking stupid to my ear. All right. Moving on to my next article, because it does come into it quite well. This is about the Munich Security Conference. And we've been going on about this. I think we definitely talked about it last week, and we might have even talked about it the week before, because J.D. Vance was bang on. All right. It's like, Europe, you got to solve your own problems. And there's this fantastic article that came to us from Peter Caddick Adams in, was this in... Which publication is this? Oh, yes, it's The Critic. And I really enjoyed reading this article. But again, it's a really, really long one. But the bit that really plays into what Eeryk was just saying is this, which I hope I've got highlighted. I do. He's talking about the impact of the security conference and how significant it is and the decisions that have been made there down through the decades. And it really is quite the security conference, right? Like you think of the United Nations Security Council in New York and the decisions that are made around that table. They're often insignificant in comparison to some of the decisions down through the decades that have been made at Munich. And given the background of how significant this conference is year in and year out, it's really picked up by the author. So let me just read you a bit. Some fastballs are in motion as I write. First, the implication of Friedrich Merz's CDU-CSU conservative win in the 23rd February federal German elections. Despite 1 in 5 voting for his NATO-critical AfD rivals, who came in second with proven credentials as a staunch Atlanticist, I mean, the guy is ex-BlackRock for Christ's sake, Merz will likely adopt a far more robust approach to Ukrainian and wider European security than his predecessors, Merkel and Scholz. Secondly, on the 11th of March, Greenland will go to the polls in a general election called by its ruling Summit Party, which will also include Denmark's semi-autonomous territory, voting on Trump's demands to acquire the island. Few anticipate it will accede to Washington's diktat and assume US forces will not occupy the sovereign territory of a fellow NATO member under duress. Wouldn't that be funny? A similar observation is made of the same rhetoric when applied to Canada, though some Trump watchers assess that these threats and others made against Panama and elsewhere are merely designed to create leverage. Give me what I want, and I won't invade or impose tariffs. What do you reckon, kid?
Well, that's what I've been thinking over the last few days, is I've been observing how easily Trump is willing to drop the tariffs. I'm like, the reason why he campaigned on blanket tariffs was that so he could just tell countries what to do. It's like, hey, you do this for me, and I won't put tariffs on you. I probably wouldn't have put them on you anyway, but because I made it clear that I was going to, I kind of have to act on my word. So do what I say, we'll be good. He's getting what he wants out of Canada, or he's working his way to doing that. Same with Mexico. He's telling Mexico, I want you to make sure this, this, and this happens. And if you do that, I'll be nicer to you on the tariff front. It's just the same. It's the same everywhere you go. He's doing the exact same strategy. So it's quite clear what he was intending to do, because he understands that there is no point in tariffs unless it actually benefits the country. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the next bit I wanted to read from the article is this. Trump has rightly triggered a very necessary European and by extension a UK debate about its foreign and defence policy. Percentage figures of increasing defence expenditure to between 2.5 and 5% of GDP are being bandied about without seeming to realise that any increase or lack of increase is also a statement of political will. Though there is no quick way to plug Europe's defence gap, the choices couldn't be more stark. Spend more immediately, something, anything, and satisfy Trump along the way, or carry vastly increased risk. There is another article about this that I wanted to bring up, and it came to us from Unheard and Tom McTagu, and this was about Gaullism, Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was probably the most significant French politician since Napoleon, and he was very much, when they talk about Gaullism, about ensuring national sovereignty and the ability to project power. Kid, what do you reckon about Europe in the absence of the American umbrella in NATO taking over more of their own security and resolving some of their own conflicts on the European continent?
I mean, I think they deserve to be forced to take over and do it themselves, to be honest. However, the way that I've been hearing them talk about it, I'm like, okay, it sounds like you guys want to sit around, have a cuppa whilst Berlin burns. Or, whilst your city over there is incinerated and that one over there is incinerated. They don't sound like they're actually thinking through a lot of the things they're saying. And they're just trying to say, oh, yes, we're tough, we can manage this on our own. Meanwhile, not actually having a plan.
Yeah, well, I think that's right, and this is the problem, right? They no longer enjoy the industrial might that they once did. All right, like the strength of the European Union, which I prefer to call the Reich, has always been a German industrial might, and they've given up so much of their industrial advantage. They've embraced nominally renewable energy sources, which is bankrupting their country because they're having to pay so much for it. The Americans blew up their gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2. They're just absolutely buggered. And what kind of opportunity do you have to invest heavily in a defense industry when you no longer have that sort of industrial base? I think that something like the much vaunted German army of the 20th century has something now like 24 operational tanks. Anyway, Mr. McTagu, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and I'm probably not, writes this. A conventional wisdom is sweeping across much of Europe as indignity is heaped upon it by the new imperator in Washington. Imperator is the Latin word for emperor. Maybe Charles de Gaulle was right after all. Finally, it seems, France's age-old push for strategic autonomy has found its moment. No longer simply an aspiration of the usual sovereigntists in Paris, but the stated ambition of the continent's most stalwart Atlanticists in Berlin, and even perhaps London too. The scale and speed of this geopolitical shift was captured by the incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz when responding to his party's victory at the weekend, declaring that his priority would be to achieve independence from the US. Once the archetype of a solid West German realist, Merz declared that Trump's behavior had left Europe with little choice. 2 days previously, the CDU leader had even argued that Germany needed to begin discussions with Britain and France about nuclear sharing because the US could no longer be relied upon. What do you think of that?
I'm thinking, where are you going to get the money from? Because I note that they've probably spent more money on importing oil from Russia, their literal enemy right now, than they have on defense spending on their own country. So yeah, that kind of raises the question. You're doing a pretty good job of funding the enemy, not so much yourself. Um, so yeah, when I heard Mers come out on election day and start being very, yes, we're going to go into Ukraine, we're going to back them up best we can. We can do it without the US. We're not going to allow Ukraine to cede an inch of territory. We're not going to bow down to Russia. All of this stuff. I'm just like, shut up. And that's when I first thought, okay, yes, you're going to do that whilst Berlin is incinerated. Good on you, lad. So yeah.
Well, and of course, what it all comes down to is, a national self-interest. It's in the interests of France to be able to protect their own interests, just as it is for Germany, for the United States, and for Russia. And it's the case that history is written by the victors, but very seldom is it the case in any war that it's good guys versus bad guys, despite what the history books tell you. What it is two countries with legitimate interests that are diametrically opposed to one another. And when you get right down to it, as they say, diplomacy is the art of saying nice doggy until you can find a big stick. And when it comes to the crunch, when conflicts eventually get resolved one way or another, there is often, it's not just necessarily territorial, it's not just necessarily armed conflict and how well military forces perform. As Karl von Clausewitz said, the military is just politics by other means. And maybe it is also economics by other means, which brings me to the next article in this bit that I wanted to read to you guys because I thought this was really funny. And it's about the Americans doing a mineral deal with Ukraine. So Ukraine is on the rack, right? Like if the Americans don't keep financing their war and giving them military hardware, they are absolutely buggered and they're going to be overrun. It is now at the negotiating stage where everyone is trying to get the best possible deal for one another. And of course, what the Americans want is mineral rights in Ukraine. This is covered for us in Euronews by Evelyn Anne Marie Adom. Ukraine and US agree on minerals deal, Ukrainian officials say. Kiev and Washington reached a broad economic deal on Tuesday, which includes the exploitation of Ukraine's rare earth metals. Ukraine and the US reached an economic deal. One of the officials who spoke on condition of anonymity said Kiev hopes the deal would improve its relationship with Washington and would ensure long-term support from the US that Ukraine urgently needs. I thought the Daily Mail's coverage of this was even better. This comes to us from David Aver. Furious Zelensky screamed at Trump's envoy for trying to make him sign a $500 billion mineral deal and was so loud he could be heard through the door and left US Treasury Secretary shaking. Erupted furiously at a senior member of Donald Trump's administration, left him trembling in fear, it was claimed today, as the US and Ukraine inch closer to a deal to end the Ukraine war. Earlier this month, Trump dispatched his newly minted Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to Kiev to present the Ukrainian leader with a deal exchanging some of Ukraine's vast mineral wealth for security guarantees against future Russian attacks. What do you think, kid?
Yeah, so I was always thinking like, why shouldn't the US try and exploit this position to, get access to minerals? I mean, that's what I would do if I was in charge of the US. It's funny, people seem to forget that the head of state of countries are, well, with the exception of ours, I suppose, because they put it in to the hands of our government, our executive branch to do it. But it's their role to put the interests of the country first and to get the best possible outcome for all of them. So if I've got the opportunity to help out a country who is either going to have our support or collapse, I'm going to do everything I bloody can to make sure it's worth my while, especially when I've already exhausted the amount of money, time, and effort into helping them. So yeah, I can't blame Trump for wanting to do that at all. Frankly, I think he should. And I suppose what's Ukraine's alternative here? I mean, Trump could always make a deal with Putin and say, "Hey, Putin, we're going to step back. You're welcome to come in and just take over everything, and in exchange, you'll give us some mineral deals. I mean,
Well, that's right, and that's right. Like that they're even talking to Ukraine is really just a courtesy, right? Because they are on the rack. And it is it's like Czechoslovakia at the Munich conference in what was it 1937, 1938. They weren't even invited when the Sudetenland was given away by the great powers. Plenipotentiaries rocked up to that conference, decided that the Sudetenland, which was Czechoslovakian territory, would be given to Germany. And that just happened. Ukraine is in a very similar position, right? Where the great powers are going to really decide what is going to happen. And what the Americans are looking to do is to sign an economic deal, which kind of transcends that to a little bit and say, okay, well, Ukraine, here's the crumbs from the table. You're not even actually invited to the negotiations about what's going to happen, but this is pretty much how it is. Sign this deal here and we'll make it better for you. You're going to give up a bit of territory to the Russians. You're probably not going to get NATO membership. And but we're going to let you kind of exist as a country. You probably shouldn't have listened to Obama when he said overthrow your democratically elected government back in 2013.
Yeah, I mean, it really is that straightforward. You brought it upon yourself. You put your eggs in the wrong basket, and it backfired. You decided that you would put it in the basket on the other side of the supermarket instead of the one at your feet. And ultimately, when you're trying to throw all of your groceries on something on the other side of the room, you're probably going to miss quite a few times.
Yeah, and it's Ukraine is one of those countries where European Union membership, NATO membership, and things like that have been a carrot that has been extended to them for a very, very long time. And Turkey was in a similar circumstance until Erdogan came along and said, "Look, we're sick of trying to please these guys. They keep offering us the carrot of European Union membership, even though Turkey is a NATO member." You'll recall that part of the Cuban Missile Crisis deal was that the Soviets wouldn't put short-range nuclear weapons in Cuba on the understanding that the Americans would remove short-range nuclear weapons from Turkey. They are a NATO member. But the carrot of European Union membership and the economic advantages that would entail was always a carrot offered to Turkey, and it influenced their domestic affairs, it influenced their foreign affairs. And finally, Erdogan said, no, these guys are never going to let us in. The Greeks particularly will always veto Turkish membership. We're better going our own way. And they did, and it has to a degree worked out for them. There are some problems with it. They're trying to reassert the Ottoman Empire's primacy within the Sunni Muslim world, which brings them into a little bit of conflict with countries like Saudi Arabia. But at least they're kind of looking more in that direction towards Asia than they are to Europe. Ukraine took a different path and went, yes, we will do what the great powers in the West want us to do because they're offering us all of these benefits. We'll overthrow our Russian-friendly, democratically elected government. We will suppress the Russian-speaking part of our population. We will give Hunter Biden $50,000 a month to sit on the board of one of our largest energy companies. We will do all of this stuff and things will be great. I would ask your average Ukrainian in the street how that decision worked out for them.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I don't have anything to add there. I think you covered it all. So
yeah, all good. All right. Well, I see we've got 3/4 of an hour to go, but we've got through our bits pretty well. Have you got any comments in the chat you want to talk about?
Unfortunately, I don't. I'm not much of the overachiever today, that's for sure.
Okay, all right. Well, look, we should probably move on to the next one. I see you've got a piece that you picked out about Winston Peters. What's that about?
Yeah, I think it's quite enjoyable watching people cry about Winston Peters just being blunt. So Otago Daily Times, Peters launches second migrant attack at Menendez March. I don't think Menendez March gets it. We just don't want Mexicans. It's from Giles Dexter of RNZ. New Zealand First MPs Winston Peters and Shane Jones have once again attacked Green MP Ricardo Menendez March for being a migrant, this time because he referred to the country's name as Aotearoa during question time. Rather than apologise, Peters has indicated he will seek to update Parliament's standing orders. The Greens have criticised the Prime Minister for a lack of accountability and said he was still yet to respond to a letter they wrote him the last time Menendez March was attacked 3 weeks ago. Yeah, so Menendez March wrote the Prime Minister a letter saying, "Those mean Maori boys, they hurt my feelings." Um, so, so yeah, I think the point there here is I think Winston Peters and Shane Jones have been making it very, very clear that they don't take kindly to people who have immigrated here coming into our parliament and trying to tell us all what we should be saying, thinking, and doing. Shouldn't be telling us how our country should run, and all of the things that we need to adopt to reach the Marxist utopia that they so long for. And I think this is the reason why that's so effective is because these migrants are not coming from countries better than our own. I think Ricardo Mendes March coming from Mexico is a prime example of that. What's it? Eliana Rabashkin coming from Colombia, or something like that
You
is
are
a
gay.
prime example of that. Julianne Genter, I mean, coming from North America, I mean, that one's questionable, but yeah.
Yeah, well, they're left-wing. New Zealand has become a dumping ground for left-wing extremists. I mean,
yeah.
this guy does not represent the domestic mainstream views inside New Zealand. He comes here, he tells us that the Treaty of Waitangi is a partnership. It's not. He made that up. He tells us that the name of our country is not New Zealand. Who is he to say that? I just think that what can you say?
Doesn't that make you gay?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, look, and just a little bit further down in the article, I just want to go over what Green Party co-leader Chloe Swarbrick said. He says to the Prime Minister was still yet to respond to the last letter the Greens wrote to him about Peters and Jones 3 weeks ago. The party planned to write to Christopher Luxon again, but Swarbrick did not expect anything to happen. We can keep writing these letters, but when what you're seeing is the Prime Minister is completely missing in action, she said. Look, as far as I'm concerned, the Prime Minister has absolutely nothing to do in this situation. This is a matter between the Green Party and the New Zealand First Party. And if the Green Party have an issue with their migrant MPs being called out by two staunch Indigenous nationalists, well, they can get the hell over it because they're the ones that want to cozy up with the Indigenous supremacist separatists. So, they're going to have to get used to these very stubborn Indigenous people telling them what's what. Because if they happen to have the luxury of going into government in 2026 alongside the Party Māori, they're going to find themselves vetoed down at every opportunity. Because when it comes to matters of this country, Te Party Māori says what happens, and the Green Party falls in line. That's how this works.
They're
So
very
yeah,
much true. And sorry, go ahead.
No, so I just wanted to. That's why I wanted to add in this article just to point out. Hey, look, the Green Party. You can bitch and moan until the cows come home. You're insignificant.
Yep. And Density reiterates your point. He writes, Maori is still always first and on top in bigger or bold writing on buildings, cars, pamphlets, and road signs. Yeah, Density, I think that people are quite over that too, of having all of the sort of cultural supremacy rammed down their throats.
Very much so. As for me, again, I'm underperforming on the. I was going off last week. We saw last week. Everyone was loving me last week in the chat. But thank you all to everyone who was tuned in nonetheless. Look, I mean, those were the 2 points I wanted to cover on this article. I find the Greens just nauseating. I just sometimes, a bit like Chris Hipkins last week, I was like, I just want Chris Hipkins to be quiet because every time he opens his mouth, he is just, well, he's being a hypocrite, quite frankly, every single time he opens his mouth. But it's the same with the Greens. They want to sit there and lecture us whilst rejecting everything they actually believe in on a daily basis, and then pretending that they haven't. So, yeah. more than happy to move on to the next article.
Right. Okay, guys. I'm sorry I haven't kept up with the chat. There's quite a few comments that I haven't been able to get to. That's my fault. There's an awful lot of buttons to push, so I don't always get to them. All right. What was our next article discussed? I think it's my turn.
Yes.
Oh goodness. And yeah, this was a good one. This was Dr. Muriel Newman writing for the New Zealand Political Research Centre on the consequences of appeasement. Did you read that?
I didn't quite get around to it, no.
Okay. All right. Well, look, I'll run through a little bit of it and get your reaction as we go through. Dr. Newman writes, New Zealand is now reaping the consequences of the misguided appeasement strategy adopted by successive governments when dealing with the growing demands of radical Maori leaders. They have bent over backwards apologising and kowtowing to these activists, even though their subversive plan to impose tribal rule represents a major threat to the future stability and security of our democracy. Having received numerous multi-million-dollar full and final settlements and an endless stream of lucrative race-based contracts, these tax-free tribal businesses have grown into something of the richest and most powerful commercial conglomerates in the country. But that's not enough. They are now using their wealth and influence to impose a form of tribal apartheid on the country. It's not called that, of course. In true Orwellian fashion, it's described as a benevolent-sounding partnership between Maori and the Crown, even though such arrangements create a two-tier society divided by race, a ruling tribal aristocracy with the power of veto and dictatorial control over decision-making, and everyone else second-class citizens in their own country. What do you think about that, kid?
Yeah, well, it is a growing problem where there is far too much appeasement, and we very much. I mean, I echo the sentiments in the article. Of course, I just need to bring that back up on my screen. But yeah, I think one of the big problems here is the full and final settlements that are multi-million dollars. What we have done for too long is we have relied on the judiciary, quite frankly, to dictate when this will be over. Okay, when is enough? I mean, we've had decades and decades and decades of settlements, of cases, of grievances, and in many cases, they're between different iwi. I mean, like, are we just going back to the 1800s where iwi were fighting each other? But instead of doing it on the battlefield, we're doing it in a tribunal. It's a drain on our taxpayers' money, and then all of these actual outcomes from these settlements are then being put onto the taxpayer to actually deal with, and fundamentally changing how elements of our systems work. Whether or not it's saying, hey, look, we should probably allow Māori to have 50% representation on that water body over there because of a settlement to do with a dispute between that hapu and that hapu that dates back around 800 or 150 years. It's just nonsensical that we actually allowing this stuff to carry on. I think we just at some point just need to take a step back. Hey, look, let's just chill out.
Yeah, I
find
think
a
that's
different
right.
way to go about it.
And I think it comes back to first principles, which is why I'm very much in favour of the Treaty Principles Bill, where it's like, okay, forget about all of this creeping Marxism, this creeping apartheid that we have. Let's come back and look at what we agree upon in terms of our fundamental constitutional relationships. Are we a liberal democracy? Do we have equality at the voting box, at the ballot box, at in front of the law, all of these things that you expect in a modern democracy? And the simple fact of the matter is we don't, because we have this creeping corporate iwi racism permeating every section of New Zealand society. As Dr. Newman points out, it's commercial around these multi-billion-dollar corrupt iwi corporations. It is inside academia with our legal Schools are forcing students to study tikanga, even though it's not part of the law, through to blue-haired bureaucrats deciding to give one another $4 million contracts to sing whale songs to trees. It is absolutely everywhere. The left does not want to have a discussion about what our fundamental constitutional arrangements are. What they want is the status quo, where they can long march through the institutions all of this creeping socialism and this creeping apartheid. What short circuits that is if we have that conversation that they don't want to have and say, right, this is the simple fact of the matter. In New Zealand, everyone is equal. Everyone has the same vote. We are not imposing racial ideology and discriminating against citizens based upon race.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I have this conversation on TikTok far too much about, what the Waitangi Tribunal says, because they're a big part of this. And the Waitangi Tribunal being very staunch on that they should be the ones to dictate what the principles are, is because if they don't dictate what the principles are, then they lose a lot of their influence. They lose a lot of their power to shape the country and to shape the various hearings and decisions they have to make in the way they want to. So by having the control, they can pick and choose. They can amend or slightly change how they interpret the treaty, so that they can say, hey, okay, this is indeed a breach for this reason, and this is what the government is now going to do. This is what we're going to recommend the government does, because of all of these ideological positions that we've established for ourselves. And what I was pointing out is this isn't something that's just been happening recently. This is something that's been going on since day dot. I go back to the likes of Sir Ian Hugh Kawharu, who was on the tribunal for 10 years, I believe, from the 70s through to the 80s or something, or 80s through to the 90s, one of the two. And, he's got a translation of the Māori text of the treaty that's designed for the purpose to show the differences between the English and Māori text. Now, not only does he fail to actually do that, but when he realizes he's failed to do that, he goes into the footnotes, writes a bunch of opinionated ideological bullshit to try and make out like what he's translated means something completely different to what he's just written. Because what the tribunal relies on is dictating what everything means, regardless of what the truth in front of them actually says.
I think that's right, and that's why we need to have these discussions. I think that particularly we need to get our constitutional arrangements in place. We need to agree collectively that we are a liberal democracy, that we do have equality. That just needs to happen, and everything else flows from there. I would add some addendums to that. I would say that New Zealand's free speech protections are nowhere near as strong enough. We should be having a discussion about adopting legislation in our Bill of Rights, which is very, very similar to the Americans' First Amendment, protecting free speech, because that is very much under attack. And for reasons like this, it's because the left cannot compete in the marketplace of ideas, and neither can the corporate corrupt iwi corporations, so they want any discussion effectively punished and outlawed. It's why you see leftists engaging in pile-ons, on cancel culture, on huge amounts of money from the Ardern regime for what they call misinformation and disinformation, which is really just a euphemism for facts that Jacinda Ardern didn't like. All right, probably enough about that. Identity says it's the red tape and regulations holding everything up. New Zealand needs, yes, and that's being addressed, I see, by the coalition, which is good work. Shelley the Kiwi says that's exactly what it's all about. First to get their hands on all the minerals in the ground. Yes, Shelley, and the water. Shelley also says it's probably time to tell Eeryk he has his hat on backwards. All right, you got any comments you want to address?
No, I don't, but I can address that hat on backwards thing. Don't blame me. It's more comfortable this way.
All right. Well, I see we've got about a half an hour to go, and we've got 2 articles left, so we've got 15 minutes we can spend on both of them. Are you ready to move on to the next one?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Sweet as. All right. Well, this comes to us from Bassett, Brash and Hyde. Did I switch you onto these guys, or did you know them already?
Yeah, I think you probably did switch me onto them. I mean, I knew it existed, but I didn't really go and look at it at all. So yeah.
They're great, right? Like just all of their commentary is just fantastic. Like
Yeah.
they don't publish a lot, but everything they publish is interesting, I reckon.
Yeah, and this one is no exception, although it's certainly one of the lengthier ones. It's from Roger Patridge, and it's titled Trump's War on Constitutional Democracy. Now, I found this interesting because it does raise the question between when is executive overreach going too far, overreach into the judiciary, I suppose, as well as the legislative branch. But it starts at the top by saying, for many conservatives, Donald Trump's return to the presidency brings hope. America's institutions desperately needed disruptions. A bloated federal bureaucracy had grown beyond democratic control. An activist judiciary regularly has legislated from the bench. Congress has proven incapable of restraining runaway spending, threatening the nation's fiscal future. The challenges go beyond just wokeness. Identity politics has corroded merit based institutions, diversity mandates override individual rights, and bureaucracies have expanded their control over daily life. But at a deeper level, the problem is institutional, a system of government that has drifted far from its constitutional foundations. Trump has promised to fix all of it. His administration has already moved to eliminate diversity programs throughout the federal government. He has ordered to end gender ideology in government documents. His Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, aims to slash regulations and shrink the administrative state. And so that was a good introduction by Robert, and I thought he really hit the nail on the head with how all of this is running deep, that it's all rotten, and it needs to be kind of just carved out and kind of almost rebuilt back up from the ground, to make sure that it's efficient, to make sure it's not exploited, make sure it's working within what's expected from their constitution. But he goes on, and quickly need to assess just how far down it was. But he goes on to explain that Trump's been acting in a way which is, one could argue, is kind of skirting the constitution's intention somewhat, and how he's just yes, here it is. The administration's aggressive use of emergency powers reveals its authoritarian tendencies. Trump has declared emergencies to justify a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican imports, citing a fentanyl crisis. He has proclaimed an energy emergency to expedite fossil fuel projects, whilst halting renewable energy development. At the southern border, he has declared another emergency to suspend asylum rights guaranteed by federal law. The point being here is that Donald Trump is declaring emergency after emergency after emergency because it justifies the use of emergency executive powers that don't require the approval of Congress. And really, the only way that they're being combated is through the courts. And one such example of that was the executive order he made declaring children born on American soil to illegal immigrants non-citizens, which is in contradiction to the 14th Amendment. And so he can't do that by executive decree. He would need that to go through a proper process to amend the Constitution. So I found that extremely interesting, and I was thinking, is this a simple case of we need to keep an eye on Trump? We need to keep an eye on any leader who is deciding, okay, we're going to put a lot of emphasis on our emergency executive powers. Or is this a case of, hey, look, we acknowledge that he is doing quite a lot of this, but we need to sit back and just watch what happens. We need to be, okay, we understand why he's doing it. It's not like there's irrational reasoning for the decisions to declare an emergency over there. I think in New Zealand we need to declare emergency on more than one thing. We need to declare an emergency on society because fundamentally too many of us are stupid and decide that racial separatism is for us, because clearly they're keen to keep voting National, clearly they're keen to keep voting Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori. There's an emergency. I'm sure if we had some executive power like that, we could say an end to university education, and that would solve that problem. But on a more serious note, I find the American system interesting, that they have the Congress, and then they have their Senate, and they have the executive having this kind of power. And for mine, I can see where the concern is. I can see why you wouldn't want a leader to have the ability to just get away with executive orders because they declare something an emergency, because you can declare anything an emergency these days. Um, so yeah, that's what I really took away from this piece, and because of how long it is, I wanted to keep it kind of rather narrow and focused. Did you have any thoughts on that, Simon?
Yeah, I do, and because the American system is very different to ours, right? Where we have, because we're a constitutional monarchy as opposed to a republic. There is with a president, there's an awful lot of power devolved to that position. It's almost like a consul in Rome dealing with the Senate, right? Like, there is to a degree a balancing act in terms of the separation of powers, but there is an awful lot of authority vested in the position of the president. In Westminster-style democracies, it's not like that. The Prime Minister is prima inter pares, but is very much inter pares amongst equals. The decision-making is seldom his to make alone, and because he is not directly elected, he can be overturned by his own caucus. In the United States, that is not the case, and that is a very, very big difference. One of the advantages of a system where you have a president like that is that you get the opportunity to make to implement policy very, very rapidly, because the decision making he has the autonomy to do that all by himself. In Westminster-style democracies, it tends to be a lot more slow-moving because it often involves a whole bunch more consensus building. Now, with that said, that is not an excuse for how slow our current government is on reversing some of the far left extremism imposed upon our society by the Ardern regime. What I really admire about Trump, because this article is right, what he is doing is really stretching the limits of what is acceptable inside a democracy. But however, if you look at the results of what he is doing, it is actually really, really positive. So it's like, okay, it's not good in terms of democracy, but in terms of outcome, it's actually pretty good for the United States. The problem with that is that's the thinking that you get from the far left in our country, where the ends justify the means. I'm much more inclined towards staying, drawing within the lines of what is actually democratic. And I think that is, in general, the safest course.
And I think that highlights why the US Constitution is so important, because if you've got a constitution set up so that a president with this executive power can't abuse it, and if they do attempt to abuse it, another branch of government, in this case the judiciary, can hold them accountable and prevent them from doing something, then that is a very good thing. But that also shows why you can't have activist judges, why you need a strong, impartial judiciary. Because if you've got the Supreme Court stacked with a bunch of far leftists, and then you get a far left president, what's the likelihood the Supreme Court's going to give a damn about upholding what the Constitution says if someone with their ideological position comes into the presidency and tries to do things that they agree with, even if it does, in fact, breach the Constitution? That's why we need to ensure that there is indeed impartial judiciary, that there is indeed a constitutional backbone that makes sure that whoever is in charge of doing certain things can't abuse that. And so, with that being said, it shows that Trump has a leash. He's not here just doing whatever he wants. He has a leash, and it's been shown that he has a leash, because some of the executive orders he's tried to put through have indeed had pushback by the judiciary. And I think what we've seen with the majority Republican Supreme Court in the US is they have to date been pretty reasonable, I've found. I mean, whilst you have I believe when Roe v. Wade first came about a few decades ago, where they decided to strip the states of the ability to make their own law on a particular issue. I believe that was a left-leaning Supreme Court at the time when they made that ruling, and that simply didn't align with what the Constitution said. And so, or at the very least, they tried to say that the Constitution justified this, that the Constitution is the reason for having this decision and making sure that things like abortion are constitutionally protected. Now, obviously, recently they decided, hey, look, we've looked at the Constitution. We decide that we're a little bit more in for an objective assessment of the Constitution. It doesn't protect that at all. Here's an idea. Let's leave it up to the states. And so I think that just illustrates how ensuring that a judiciary is impartial, able to assess the Constitution, uphold the Constitution is important, and that relates to executive powers of the president and Trump in this case. So, yeah.
I encountered a new word yesterday, and it might even have been Elon Musk who mentioned it. It was like judicocracy. It was a term for judges controlling democracy. And I see that the Trump administration is lining up senior jurists and saying, look, you're losing your jobs and so on. And you'll recall, this is a big thing for me, that I don't believe that here in New Zealand that our judges are anything like as representative of the interests of the people as they ought to be. I think that they have far too much autonomy to do things like resist the will of the people, to decide that Liz Gunn is committed assault because the particular judge is friends with Chris Hipkins and Jacinda Ardern, that decide that Golriz Garriman's judge is one of her friends for her trial. All of this sort of nonsense that they get away with, let alone blatantly ignoring the will of Parliament, can be reversed if we make judgeships elected positions. And I saw the statistics yesterday. It's something like 87% of the judges in the United States are elected positions, and the majority, and maybe it might even be the remaining 13%, are appointments by either the elected government or the White House directly. Now, I'm not actually sure on that detail, but what I think is a good thing is that the majority of their judges are going for election all of the time, like every 5 years or so on and so forth, and putting their record to the people for the people to decide. Because at the end of the day, the law is not this what would you say, the statue that a priestly class of ideologues get to interpret on behalf of the rest of us. What it is a flexible system for how we behave towards one another. It is a judge's job to reflect what the people think our behavior should be towards one another, not for them to decide on our behalf what that is and dictate it to us.
Yeah, and I was watching a submission on the Treaty Principles Bill just yesterday, I believe, and one such submitter, he I believe he used to actually be on select committees on the other side of things, and he was talking about how judges and lawyers and all of these people that interpret law aren't looking at the law the same way that every other average people do, and that's the difference between things like the select committee process and other and other forms of not only the legislation or the legislative process, but also just the judiciary and how they come about making decisions in cases of various kinds. And they fundamentally look at everything through this very academic, legal lens, but don't adequately assess things and take into account
in terms of the
view and the perspective of the everyday people that the decision actually impacts and that
I think
the decision is relevant to. So, yeah.
That wasn't Stephen Franks' submission by any chance?
It probably was. If it was a submission and it was talking about that, it was rather unique, so it probably was him.
Yeah. Who's the other chap who's had an awful lot to say, that the Auckland law professor called a dinosaur and told him to go and die? I think his surname is Kidd. Is that right? I forget. Gary Judd, is that his name?
Judd does ring a bell. Judd does ring a bell, yeah.
I think it is. I've been meaning to go, whoever that chap is, and maybe someone in the chat can remind me. He's the KC who gave a really, apparently a fantastic submission to the Justice Select Committee, and I haven't yet gone and watched it, and I probably should have. Maybe it's something I'll talk about on my show on Sunday night, which reminds me, I should probably just take a break and talk to the audience about that. I see that you've stood up and you're doing your own show again by yourself. That's a regular thing now this week by week, is it?
No, so I haven't even properly launched that yet. I was just testing out a few different things. So it wasn't even an official show, but soon.
Soon.
Mm.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah. Yeah. I should probably go and look that up. But guys, if you in the chat, if you know who that is, I think it's Gary Judd is that chap's name. But anyway, I'll talk about that on my Sunday show. All right. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about with this article?
No, that about wraps it up for me. I just wanted to highlight that whole issue of constitutional overreach. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, well,
Good.
I think that there is an appetite amongst New Zealanders. I think that, we realise that this stuff needs to be addressed. We just can't have the creeping communism and the creeping apartheid, which was accelerated by the Ardern regime. We need to have the conversations about what our constitutional arrangements are, what our obligations and our duties are to one another, and get that sorted and agreed, and then all other conversations can flow through from there. There was some interesting news which has caused a great deal of consternation. Since I pulled this article up, Gary Judd says, citizen of Auckland from YouTube. Thank you very much, Gary Judd. I thought that was right. Since I bought this article up from me and the kid to review, there's been an awful lot of discussion, and that is the right to citizens' arrest. Now, there is a real problem in New Zealand with citizens' arrest because we have a police who are utterly corrupt. The police service in New Zealand is inherently corrupt, and they do not like what they consider people taking the law into their own hands, which is a euphemism for doing their jobs for them. They are inclined to prosecute people who do things to prevent crime because our police, as I say, are utterly corrupt. You will see that the national government has expanded the rights of citizens' arrest. Up until this change, it could only be affected by a citizen at night and under very, very particular circumstances. That is now changing, and this article discusses it. Let me bring it up. It comes to us from Raphael Franks. I think he's a total dickhead, but this is an interesting article anyway in the Herald. Citizens arrests. NBR owner Todd Scott, tackler of would-be countdown thief, backs law change. A prominent Auckland businessman who tackled a would-be thief says allowing citizens arrest would be common sense and lead to fewer thugs trying it on. News publisher Todd Scott, owner of the National Business Review, acted on instinct when he lunged at a man trying to steal a box of beers at Countdown on Lower Albert Street in September 2023. However, when supermarket staff phoned police, they said, meaning the police, said Scott should let the crook go or risk being arrested himself. You heard that right. The New Zealand police threatened a citizen who prevented a crime with arrest and prosecution himself for holding the criminal. This is why our police service in New Zealand is no longer fit for purpose. In my opinion, it cannot be reformed. The corruption inside our police service is too deep, and they must be replaced. What I want to see is a gendarmerie, a part of the military which is seconded to the civilian government that has as its principles upholding the rule of law on the one hand, but on the other, upholding civil liberties. And we don't get this from the police. What do you think, kid?
I think it's ludicrous, quite frankly. And I sit there and I'm thinking, why would we want to punish people who want to protect others? That's what it comes down to at the end of the day. When you're wanting to make a citizen's arrest or stop someone committing a crime, it's because you're looking after your community, and that's what we should be celebrating. That's what we should be supporting. Now, of course, you don't want people to be stupid. You don't want people to just go out of their way and become a vigilante or anything like that. But it is important that people, when they see something bad going on, that they are given the knowledge and they're not afraid of the consequences for intervening. I mean, I think back to a New York subway where Daniel Penny was, protecting a carriage full of people who were being threatened, even I think potentially attacked by a man, and he restrained him and held on too long. I mean, he was punished, but ultimately acquitted of that act because he was doing a public service where no one else could or would. He was doing what needed to be done, and I don't think anyone should be punished for that. When I see someone who is having their let's say their dairy robbed, if I'm in a position to actually stop that robbery happening, I should be able to stop that robbery happening without being punished for it. And so when at the end of the day, I 100% support these changes. And the important thing about the changes is it doesn't force you to do anything. It doesn't force you to put yourself in harm's way. It doesn't force you to take the law into your own hands. What it does do is provide you a little bit of leeway, a little bit of opportunity to help out your fellow citizen without fear of consequence.
Okay, can you hear me again, kid?
Yeah, I saw you. You disappeared for a moment there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I lost my camera again. Oh, dude, I'm having to hold it up. All right, but at least you can hear me. I'm going to put it down. You can still hear my voice, all right?
Yep, we're good.
Yeah, sweet as, mate. Yeah, I think you bang on. Just to read a little bit more of this article. The Herald understands Justice Minister Paul Goldsmith and Associate Justice Minister Nicole McKee will detail intentions to amend the Crimes Act to make it easier for retail staff and members of the public to make citizens arrest, effectively detaining an offender until police arrive. Scott told the Herald, "It's just common sense. Things are out of control in New Zealand and the people have the ability to do what I did in this situation. I believe we'd have fewer thugs trying it on. My advice to people is this: it is better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6. Every person fundamentally has the right to defend themselves, to defend their life, to defend their families, to defend their property. What I say to people is don't second guess your instincts. But if our utterly corrupt police service charges you, the hero, with a crime, rely upon your fellow citizens. Don't go for a judge alone trial. Go for a jury trial every time. Rely upon 12 of your peers, of your fellow citizens to say, no, this is wrong. This person acted in the interests of society and deserves to be rewarded and not prosecuted. Because here's what happens with a corrupt police force like we have in New Zealand, with an activist judiciary like we have in New Zealand. We cannot rely upon either institution for justice, but we can rely upon one another. Kid, what do you reckon?
Yeah, the whole have a jury of your peers instead of a judge thing actually made me pause for a minute, because I've always had this staunch belief that I would never want a jury of my peers. I would always prefer a judge trial. But I do suppose it depends on what the charge is. I do suppose it depends on what's actually happened. Because very much if it's a case like this, a jury of your peers is, no matter what, very likely going to be on your side. But I suppose when it comes to different types of things you could find yourself in hot water for, a jury could fundamentally screw you over. And so I feel like when it comes to something that's very, very severe, like someone that's been falsely accused of a very serious offence, I feel like juries naturally are less likely to fully separate the emotion from the law, whereas I feel like a judge is more capable of doing that in those sort of situations. But 100% for a case where you've just tackled some guy who's tried to steal a box of beers, you'd be stupid not to go with the jury of your peers, I'd say, because frankly they'd probably buy you a beer afterwards. So yeah.
I think you're exactly right. Have you seen any of the reaction to this news from the leftists?
Leftists, I mean, I think a couple of them were saying, oh yeah, now the governments can't deal with crime themselves and they can't recruit police, so instead they're just getting all of their supporters to go out and be vigilantes, something like that.
Well, I saw Ginny Anderson. She's the ginger, I think, from The Hut, who always looks like she's just been banged over a wheelie bin outside of a pub, and she was bitching and moaning about it, of course, because you'll recall that she was, I think, police minister in the.
I think she was both for a little bit.
Yeah,
she was police and justice for a little bit. Yeah.
right? And absolutely incompetent. And a part of the ideology of the far left, Dern Hipkins regime, was to empty the prisons, right? They had a target of releasing prisoners, 30% of them, and they did. They went out of it. They instructed their friendly judges to go easy, to look at home detention rather than prison sentences. They emptied the jails. They did all of that sort of good stuff, and which led to soaring crime rates in this country. Now, of course, that is being reversed, which very much reflects what people want. People are sick and tired of crime in their streets. I talk to retailers around me. They do not want it anymore. They want it gone. And of course, you could rely upon someone like Ginny Anderson to bitch and moan about it. You didn't see any of that?
I didn't see Ginny Anderson's thing, no, but I saw a few people like Clint Smith and the usual suspects who are always bitching on behalf of the Labor government. But no, I didn't look at any Labor MPs' reactions. Certainly not.
Okay, well, the other thing I saw on social media was Watia News. Watia News is some leftist taxpayer-funded news source, which has a focus upon Maori affairs, and I never read their articles, and I don't really know an awful lot about them. But they had I saw some comments when they put an article up on some other social media platform. People were screenshotting them and showing them on places like X, places I do go and read content, and some of the reactions were just hilarious. They were talking about this being lodging a treaty of Waitangi claim with the Waitangi Tribunal about adjusting this law. And I was reading and thinking, good God, you know that most Maori are not criminals. This is not, it's just like, what are you people thinking? You're making out like this is anti-Maori discrimination when it's about criminals. It's not about a race thing.
And if I may, if there's one thing that you can trust on a Māori to do is to kick someone up the arse if they deserve it. So, this is just useful for them.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And good on them. Like I think, many problems in society can be solved with a quick clip around the ear. But it just seemed to me absolutely ridiculous that they were. It was almost like the casual racism of low expectations. It's like, okay, this is going to negatively impact Maori because Maori are criminals, and I refuse to accept that.
Yeah, if anything, it's actually reducing the number of Māori that are arrested for stupid reasons like tackling a shoplifter. Yeah, so it's got an inverse effect as well. But that's just that comes with the territory with leftists who don't really think through any of the positions they actually hold. They just see something, they're like, oh, okay, that was that racist government proposed that, and no, we can't have that at all. Just how they operate.
Well, it tends to be, and I think that it just shows how intellectually subnormal left-wing thought is, thought in quotes, that they can't actually look at this and think, well, maybe there is a problem and it does need to be addressed. They go straight to the race card. There's just any reason whatsoever to ensure that crime continues. It's like you hear Chloe Swarbrick talking about closing prisons. It's like, okay, well, if we do that, what are we going to do with all the murderers, the rapists, and the child molesters, other than put them on the Green Party list?
It's called restorative justice. Basically, you get a group of people who have been affected by the event, you put them in a room and they chat about it. It's got a success rate of about next to fuck all. Yeah.
All right.
So
I've got some comments to respond to. Excalibur is here. Good evening, or rather good morning in London. I worked at Robbie Burns for years. We always detained shoplifters, called the police who came and arrested them and put them through the system every single time. That was late 80s through until 1999. Robbie Burns, gosh, that is going back, says Shortland Chambers. Yeah, it is. Shelley the Kiwi's got an interesting comment. She says, crime pays in NZ. You can change fines over to periodic detention and work out at $40 odd an hour, and and with the minimum wage at 25 or something, it's crime pays. Well, that's right. You're actually $40 an hour is what they convert a fine to PD to. That's fascinating. Simon Futter notes, so I am the bad guy because I don't ring police and put charges on them and a restraining order, or do I wait and use street justice? Well, yeah, I don't believe in vigilante justice, Simon Futter, but I do believe that our justice system should be reformed. Shelley says, I have a photo standing next to Robbie Burns' statue in Dunedin. Fantastic. Fantastic. That's well, that's all good. You got any comments you want to discuss?
No.
No? Okay.
Or me. No.
No, okay, all right. Well, look, I don't think too many people joined us on X tonight.
No, unfortunately.
No, I got a few people are watching on YouTube. Hello, YouTube, and seeing a bunch of people who subscribe to me on Substack. I'm really glad to have included Substack in the mix, because people who like to read my written word get the opportunity to interact with me and watch me on screen. Although I am someone who does look better in soft lighting, it must be said. But look, thank you everyone for joining us again for another episode of the Eeryk and Simon Show. I will be back on Sunday night for Simon TV. Hope you'll join me at 8:30 in the evening. But I'm going to let the kid take us out. From me, it is good night.
Sweet. Thank you very much, Simon, for joining me once again this evening, as well as everyone else who joined from home, whatever you were doing. Bit of a quiet night, but it was a good one. I think it's been a pretty busy week for some people. It's quite hot tonight as well, so that probably doesn't help people just relaxing, cooling down, having a beverage. But that's good for me. I will be streaming at some point between now and next Wednesday. I will try and make sure it doesn't conflict with Simon TV on Sunday, as I deliberately push mine back, not to conflict with it. So maybe I don't know, maybe Friday or something like that. We'll see how things go. But yeah, that's me. Hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thanks for joining us here on a very special Wednesday, or Friday becomes Wednesday, episode of the Eeryk and Simon Show. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.